Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, a look at child adoption through the eyes of adoptees. We're here from a group of South Koreans and how the adoption system shaped their lives. Well, this is a subject that's resonated with our international community. Malika Balau is our digital producer. What are you seeing? What stories are people sharing?
Well, I want to show you this. This is something that sums up what other people have tweeted us. This was shared to us by Rahel, and she says this is Korean adoption bingo. It's a humorous look at some of the questions that Korean adoptees say they get far too often. So here you have, you should be grateful that you were adopted, and if you hadn't been adopted, you wouldn't have had the internet. So we'll take a serious look at those, of course, so we want your help to do that. You can tweet us your questions and comments with hashtag AJStream.
Now in the studio with us we have Laura Kleiss, and Laura is a Korean adoptee who was raised in the United States. And Laura, we're going to hear a lot more about your story in just a moment.
With pleasure.
Looking forward to hearing more from you. Now, you can actually interact with this very conversation using the Stream's new app. You can download it and follow along. You'll see the address right at the bottom of the screen. You'll find quizzes, global stats on adoption, and some exclusive content that's not actually in this very show. So it's another way for you to be in the stream.
Hi, I'm Zarina Graywall. I'm author of Islam as a Foreign Country, professor at Yale University, and I'm in the stream.
Since the 1950s, more than 240,000 South Korean babies have been adopted by families mainly in the United States, Sweden, and other Western nations. Many of these were children who were born to unwed mothers facing pressure from Korea's conservative social values. Child adoption practices began as a way to deal with Korean war orphans and eventually led to a boom in overseas adoption during the 1970s and 80s. Now into adulthood, some Korean adoptees are critical of the practices that took them away from their native culture. So today we're going to hear a variety of perspectives on the Korean adoptee experience. With us to talk about this via Skype in Seoul, we have Jane Jong Trenker. She's president of the group Truth and Reconciliation for the Adoption Community of Korea. Also in Seoul, Tammy Chu, an adoptee activist and documentary filmmaker. And in Los Angeles, Steve Morrison, he founded the group Mission to Promote Adoption in Korea. So I guess it is great to have you all here in this conversation. Let me start with some characters that we found on YouTube. These are all Korean young adults who are all adoptees from the United States. Here's what they're saying about their experience growing up in the US.
Oh, hey, this is my brother Matt.
Bye.
Yeah, I was adopted as a baby.
And I thank my parents every day that they adopted me. And I thank my birth parents for giving me the opportunity to live a better life here in America.
Being adopted, you just don't have anyone you can identify with.
One of the most common questions I get as an adult when people know me or find out that I'm adopted is two questions. Have I ever searched my birth mother, and or would I want to meet her?
I went to Korea, met my birth family, had lots of feelings, lots of emotions, both good and bad, and now is kind of the moving forward part.
So Jane, you were adopted in the US. What was it like for you growing up? What's the one memory that you could share with us where you think, this sums up my experience?
There are a lot of memories, but I think a really salient feature of my adoption is that I was adopted into rural Minnesota, and after experiencing the kind of isolation that accompanied that, I went to Minneapolis for school, and I was stalked and almost killed, and it was a racialized, sexualized violence there. So definitely there were some problems with my parents not addressing the fact that I was from a different country and I did look different, and sort of the accompanying stereotypes about Asian American women that I experienced and I wasn't prepared for.
Jane, that's a horrific experience. You shared with us, so I appreciate you sharing that with us. that could have happened regardless of your ethnic background. But I want to show you and our audience this picture. This is you and your sister and your mum and dad. So when you were younger, when they were taking care of you, how did they address the fact that you have a different heritage?
They just didn't at the time. The thought was that parents were supposed to assimilate their children, and so we were just supposed to pretend that we were biological children, practically. Yeah, so that's...
and what was that like? So you were pretending to be a little American girl. You kind of were a little American girl, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, and so, I mean, that's all I knew, but... And I think that people are doing better now with addressing culture and race and so forth. And I guess my thing is not about parenting or not how we should deal with racial difference better after the adoption. I'm working more in South Korea with the causes of adoption and what we can do as far as public policy in Korea.
Right. Laura, let me bring you into this conversation.
Please.
You have an experience where you were brought up in the US as an adoptee to American parents.
Yes.
How was that for you?
So I think that the biggest difference between my experience and Jane's is the fact that I grew up in a biracial family. Which I think introduces, some other questions and other issues.
Yeah, I'm looking at your mum and dad now,
yes,
and this picture is not quite as jarring as Jane's picture. If that was something that you were looking at, if ethnicity
certainly
was a big deal for you, this picture looks like it might have been an easier life for you.
So in some regards, I think yes, because as people looked at how my brother and I did or didn't fit into the family, when I was out with both of my parents, you could conceivably believe that I could have been my parents' biological child. I think that being said, I've known and been proud of being an adoptee for as long as I can remember. My mom is Japanese American. My dad is obviously a white guy. But I think that for us, the important takeaway has been that what makes us a family are all of the different things that we share, which certainly don't include country of origin, but do include a lot of other facets that have unarguably shaped who I am and the way that I see the world.
Do you want to give us one of those other facets? Because often when people see you as a family, they see these certain striking characteristics. Other facets you think are more important are what?
I think that for me personally, my identity is certainly as an adoptee. It's as an Asian American, a Korean American. It's as a lesbian. It's as someone from the city of Seattle. It's from someone who is an athlete, someone who is a musician. And that's not to say that any of those things trump national origin or race, but I think that oftentimes we get into the habit of arguing, whether explicitly or otherwise, that blood and biology are fundamentally what constitute family, and I don't agree with that.
You're not alone in that. I want to share this tweet. This is from someone who was adopted from Haiti and raised in Canada with Canadian parents. The Global Nomad says, I was raised proud of my origins, but also enriched by my parents' culture and the innumerable opportunities afforded to me by Canada. But Tammy, this next person on Twitter has a question on those same lines. Nasihan says, the idea behind international adoption may be great, but how do adopted kids get a sense of belonging and identity in a new culture? Tammy?
Right. I think that, as we've heard, there are various stories of, from various perspectives of having good adoptions or bad adoptions. So far positive experiences, but I think that I would like to think about the larger, look at the larger picture of international adoption, and there is the issue of belonging and identity and what is lost when one is adopted. Whether you have a good adoptive experience or not, it doesn't discount what losing your heritage and being taken out of your native country and away from your family.
What's that loss, Tammy? Can you explain? Put that into words.
Well, I think that it's a one-way trade where it's not equal. There is this trade of children being sent overseas from developing countries, although Korea is not a developing country anymore, into the West.
Yeah.
And so, the children experience, most of the time, these children are adopted into white or Caucasian families, and oftentimes in suburban or rural areas. And so a lot of myself and a lot of adoptees, our experiences growing up was that we felt isolated, and especially if we were adopted in the 70s and 80s, growing up where there was, very few images of people of color in the media and very few role models. And of course, there may be positive role models who are white, but in terms of being able to embrace your Asian identity, it was very difficult, as well as I think, when you look in the mirror and you look really different and you feel like there is something wrong with you, and it's this internalization of racism that manifests itself into self-hatred and denial of yourself and your identity. And for some adoptees, they do explore those issues when they get older, but sometimes it's too painful, and so they live a life of almost as if they are themselves white American or white European, where they don't
let me ask Steve about this. Let me first of all show you Steve's mum and dad here. Steve, your mum and dad look adorable. This is you with your mum and dad. Does anything that Tammy says resonate with you? Did you feel as an adoptee that you were just hanging out there and nobody was taking care of you? You had no connection with your Korean heritage or roots at all?
Let me kind of explain, because my adoption is somewhat different from other adoptees that came when they were infants or babies. I lost my family when I was 5 years old, and was admitted to orphanage when I was 6, and I grew up in orphanage 8 years and got adopted when I was 14 years old. So I had an orphanage life, and I know what it's like to be living in an orphan life. And so when I came to my family, the Morrison family, I was very grateful, and I was very happy because the way they treated me and loved me was just something that I've never experienced. And another thing was that when I was in an orphanage, I was not a really good student. But as soon as I came over to America, I started to excel in school and started to have dreams of my own. And so that's what adoption has done for me.
See, Steve, this is what I hear a lot for the sort of the pro-adoption idea, is that sometimes the family that you go to is much better than the circumstances that you left. And doesn't that trump ethnicity and how you look and if you fit in with the rest of the community? Where do you fall on that debate?
Yeah, I think any children, I think the adoption in general, and there are some exceptions, but in general for adoption, it provides an opportunity for homeless children to make something of themselves. And that's what I think adoption.
Jane, go ahead.
I would like to kind of try to steer the train in a little bit different direction. I know that in adoption we often get talking about outcomes, and it's all about like, well, how did it turn out? How did it turn out? And I would like to argue that like everybody should have a great experience, and I'm really happy that Steve had a great experience and that many adoptees had a good experience, because that's what we all deserve. And we all deserve to go from a situation that was not a good one to a situation that's better, because that's what adoption is supposed to be. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way all the time. But I think if we're going to follow this sort of train of thought about all of these opportunities that you're supposed to get, like what happens if you don't take those opportunities? Like what happens if you go to the United States and you drop out of high school? Like should you be returned so another more opportunist orphan can have that? And I'd like to return this again to a public policy issue, because we can play actually doing anecdotes all day long. I've got an anecdote for you about the Korean War orphan named Park Sung-joon, who became a great political dissident. He's married to the first woman prime minister of South Korea, and he was able to make his way just fine in South Korea because he's a brilliant man.
But that kind of cases are so far in between, and most orphans who grow up in orphanage, they stay in the orphanage, and they stay there for 18 years, and they get kicked out of the orphanage, and really having a hard time living in another society. To me, that
right.
seems
So
like a greater loss.
We can play dueling anecdotes all day long. So I would like to talk about public policy. I would like to talk about what is South Korea doing for women's rights? What are they doing for children's rights? What is the country doing to uphold its international treaty obligations? It is obviously not up to international standards because, and we know this by looking at their international treaty obligations, which they refuse to meet, which is they have a reservation to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which makes counseling mandatory, that parents are giving full consent before their children are sent for adoption. They have not yet ratified the Hague Convention. They only signed it last year.
Jane, let me just tell everybody who's watching. Jane is president of the group Truth and Reconciliation for the Adoption Community of Korea. Jane, let's cut to the chase here. What is your group trying to do?
We are trying to improve the adoption system.
Because why?
Because it is not ethical, and it's not upholding
I don't really see that
standards.
coming from your organization. I think your organization is more about stopping inter-country adoption. And
no, it's actually.
If I can interject,
that you guys are doing, yeah.
If I can interject really quickly, I think that it's been interesting to learn, and I'll admit that it's been recently, of all of the different kinds of work that are ongoing in an effort to address what I think are some very real issues and challenges associated with adoption. Jane is doing a wonderful job of describing the importance of addressing in-country support for women and their families, and I think that that's a critical piece of the overarching story.
And Lauren, let me just interject in your interjection. Don't lose that thought. I was just looking at stats. Don't take this because it's very boring charts here. But the biggest group of children who are put up for adoption are from unwed South Korean mums. So that is the biggest group of children that are put up for adoption. So when we know that, then please continue.
Well, then I think that it's important to take into consideration what opportunities there are from a public policy perspective to improve the support and to address the stigma that those women are facing. However, at the same time, I think that where I have a little bit of trouble, are any arguments that are predicated on the basis that in order for a child to have a healthy upbringing, that child needs to share race and national origin of their adoptive parents. I think that's where I disagree.
We were talking about unwed mothers, and so with the unwed mothers, let's talk about what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that the unwed mother can get $70. Unwed mother or single parents can get about US $70 per month in support. The orphanages are getting about $1,000 per child per month in support. And foster parents and adoptive parents are somewhere in between there, and they're getting incredible amounts of support for children's mental health, for their physical well-being, for dibs on apartments, and all kinds of things. And so actually the budget is there to help unwed mothers to raise their own children.
That's great.
Because they're already giving it to other people. All they have to do is reallocate it in the way that is what we all agreed the best, which is to stay with their original parents. And Steve, I think on your blog you've said that you're not sure that single parents are the best people to be raising their children, and I strongly disagree with you.
All right, so just take a pause for a minute. Jane, take a pause for a minute, because we have the international community also want to be in this conversation. Malika, where are you going to take us?
Well, Jane mentioned that the budget is there, but online what people are saying is that may be true, but there's still a stigma. The public support may not be all the way there. So on Facebook, we got this comment from Liz, who says, I lived in Korea for a time, and it's an absolute taboo to adopt. That attitude needs to change first, otherwise kids end up in orphanages. And from Korea, Jiho wrote us this: there's a stereotype such as adoptive parents dislike adopted babies. There's discrimination between born and adopted babies from people. So how do you go about changing that perception and those stereotypes, Tammy?
Actually, so I think this is a really important point. Those comments were true, and to some degree it is true, but it's actually changing in Korea. There are more adoptive parents. There are more parents who are adopting domestically, and the stigma has decreased. And so you have celebrities who are promoting domestic adoption, and you also have adoptive parents who are forming groups, support groups, and who are really interested in promoting domestic adoption, as well as being a part of their child's life just as they would with their biological children. And so this idea that if there's stigma, you can't allow the excuse that because there's stigma against unwed mothers and children is a reason to not have domestic adoption or to not have children grow up in their home country, I think is very limiting, because it's the idea that any kind of rights, whether if you look at the civil rights movement or women's rights movement, there was always a point of discrimination and a need for change. And unless people decide to create change, the change doesn't happen. And so, I understand that, there's a lot of positive effects of adoption where adoptees have great experiences, but
let me ask you briefly, Tammy, because we've got 3 more minutes left and I'm taking you all to the post show. So is international adoption unethical?
I think that the current system, yes, there are aspects that are unethical, and it's a broken system. And I believe that international adoption should be the last resort. I'm not against it, but I think that the first and foremost should be to keep families together, family preservation, and secondly, domestic adoption, and then lastly, international adoption.
Steve?
Okay, I agree with Tammy what she just said. That really goes with the Hague Convention of returning to birth family first, and then domestic adoption and inter-country adoption, the last resort. However, my fear is that many children, if they don't get to be adopted domestically or go to birth family, they wind up going to orphanages.
I think, Steve, the thing is that, if there is
families in inter-country. Yeah.
I think that, the idea that there are not enough domestic adoptive families, that's kind of true, and your organization is working on that, right? And the government has made this policy for domestic adoption first, and up until now, for the past 9 years, it's been sort of a huge failure. And so if they don't want to send children for international adoption, and we know that the international adoptions are not ethical, and we can see that by how they are not meeting international treaty obligations, and people don't want to adopt them so much in country, that means that the only and the best choice is to stay with their mothers.
However,
provided that that's what their mothers prefer.
Unfortunate thing is that
I'd also like to add.
All right, so guests, I've got all 4 guests all wanting to talk at the same time. So I know that we're close to the end of the show, because that always happens close to the end of the show. Just take a pause for a moment, guests. I'll come right back to you. Malika, what is the international community, how are they reacting to this conversation?
I'll give you someone who is showing us both sides of the divide, and this is a video comment sent from someone who adopted 2 children of her own.
Now, what happens to the unwanted child, though? The child that is not wanted by either biological family or by community or anywhere really within the borders to be held in a loving parent's arms. Well, in that case, I think there's still a role for international adoption that is ethical and transparent, because in my view, cultural and ethnic identity is very important and yet does not trump the potential of a child who is raised by a loving parent.
So interesting perspective there from Mitali.
Okay, very good. So we are going to come back with our guests, Jane Jong Trenker, Laura Kleiss, Steve Morrison, Tammy Chu. You heard them all piping up. We have so much more to talk about, so do come with us to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Now, on the next show, who's in charge of Yemen? Good question. We'll try and find you a very good answer on the next A-Day stream. Stay with us. Post show's next. Stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about the international adoption and experiences of South Korean adoptees. Let's get right back to the conversation. Steve, I had no idea you would be so provocative. You were trying to make a point and everybody was piling in on top of you. Everybody peel back. Steve, what did you want to say?
Well, you know, the truth of the matter is that as much as I would like to see more unwed mothers to keep their babies, the truth is that significant majority of them still give up their rights. Adoption process now takes about 2 years long, and unwed mothers are contacted numerous times by the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the court system and adoption agencies, but so many of them, and great majority of them, still do not want to keep their children. And this lesson, like 2 years long. And so for anyone to say that adoption is causing separation between birth mother and child is really a nonsense to me.
Actually, I made a film called Resilience, and it was about birth mothers. It focuses on one particular birth mother, but during the research process, I actually interviewed several birth mothers as well as single mothers and unwed mothers, and actually that's contrary to the case. A lot of the stories that I heard was that they were forced to give up their children for adoption. For example, when an unwed mother would go into an unwed mother's home, they would be
hundreds of them give up their children, and hardly anyone reclaim their children. They're just handful, even today.
All right, so we have different experiences from our guests, and so that we don't go round in circles, let me just check in with Malika.
I have a question from someone who's in the know on this issue and works on this issue. I'd like you all to have a listen to this and let me know what you think.
I've worked in post-adoption services for a little over 10 years now, and we here at the agency have struggled at times really connecting and engaging with the adoptee advocate voice. And I'm curious what the panel thinks in terms of what are some steps or what are some successful strategies that the international adoption industry can take that will help us engage further and more meaningfully with these adoptee advocates.
So Jane, if there was one strategy that you could give as advice, what would you say?
Hi, Steve. So I met Steve last summer in Korea, and I'm going to suggest the same thing to Steve now that I did last summer, which is come on over to Korea and spend a year here. We'd love to have you, and spend a year here and find out how your partner Holt Korea is working and how they are doing birth family search and how they are treating adoptees and so forth. And then I think that could be really helpful. Also, I want to point out, since Steve is on the other Steve is on the screen now, you had mentioned that all of these unwed mothers are giving up their children, and I want to point out something that people don't really know, which is that there has been no body, and there still is no body in South Korea to enforce child support. It has been legislated. It was legislated last year into existence, and it will kick into effect this year. But until now, even if an unwed mother got a court ruling or a divorced mother got a court ruling for child support from the baby's father, there was nobody to enforce it, and so that meant that almost nobody got payments, or they would get it once, and then that was it.
Jane,
so that might be a
bring
reason.
us back to international adoption. Why would you bring that out for international adoption? Make the connection for us as viewers around the world. Why would you bring up child support and international adoption? Mums are giving up their kids because they can't afford to keep them. Is that the connection?
Yes, that is exactly
simple.
the connection. So there's an economic reason,
and there's
also
just economic. I mean, they're giving up more because the society's unacceptance of unwed mothers. So
I don't think that anybody on the call is arguing that we shouldn't be supporting unwed mothers, or that we shouldn't be trying to provide resources that allow families to stay together. I don't think that is something that we're debating. I think, though, that
yes, I would agree with you, but the issue is that the current system, that is exactly what the current system is doing. The current system is not. It's not a system that does allow single mothers or unwed mothers.
So the current system is creating an adoption culture.
They have all the rights in the world. Look at the orphanage.
Yes,
it's overflowing with 17,000 children, and parents are not coming to get them.
All right, guess let me make sure.
But I think that while it's
give me a moment. Just give me a moment here. Just to make sure I understand you clearly. you are saying that the current system is creating an international adoption culture. Jane, that's what you're saying?
Yes. Yes, that is exactly right. And it is a supply and demand system, and there are push factors and there are pull factors, and
but right now, I'm even looking at stats from the Korean Ministry and Health and Welfare Department. There are more domestic adoptions than international adoptions, and in fact, every year they're going lower and lower and lower. So every baby counts, but the baby count is going down lower. Steve.
Actually, the inter-country adoption has been going down not because natural process, but by government's policy of continuing to reduce each year.
Okay.
And so they can make it look like that domestic adoption is more than inter-country
so
adoption.
I mean, you have to be careful what you see in the figures.
In 2007.
Okay, Malika.
Laura, I got this a tweet from Margie, and she's also closely tied to this issue, and she asks, is inter-country adoption ethical? And she says, not while adoptees are denied the same rights to history and genetic family as non-adoptees. So I'm wondering if there were an adoptee Bill of Rights, what would some of the things you would want to be on it?
So I'm willingly going to concede that I'm probably not the best person to respond to that specific question, just because, quite frankly, it isn't something that I've taken the time to think through in the context of international law. I think you have some folks on the line who are equipped.
Can I jump in?
However,
you're going to answer it anyway.
However,
because you have an answer to everything.
However,
yes,
what I think we haven't touched upon in the conversation, and that's not to say...
Oh, all right, hold tight for a moment, all right? Let's get this answered before you move things on.
Certainly.
Malika, who do you want to answer this?
Well, I heard Jane piping up. Jane, did you have an answer to this?
Actually, it was me, Tammy.
Tammy, go ahead.
Actually, I think that is a very great, good point that Margie brings up. No, that's not the case currently, that adoptees have a Bill of Rights or the fact that they have the same rights. There is this erasure of culture and heritage that an international adoptee faces when they're adopted. And I think that is a really important issue that is left out of the discussion, is this idea that it's okay for a child to be taken out of their native country and separated from their family to be adopted into another country. I'm not saying it's a negative thing, but to really think critically, it's not just it's not as simple as a child having a loving home. That child loses so much.
Tammy, this International Adoption Bill of Rights was the question, Malika, right? Okay, guess, hold on. Let me see if we can get an answer for the community member who was really keen about this. Should there be an International Adoption Bill of Rights for the baby, Tammy?
Yes, of course, definitely.
What would be on it? What do you think should be in it?
Well, I think that there should be a Bill of Rights in terms of access to your birth records. Currently, there's no system. It's at the random whim of the social worker that decides to help you if you go to an adoption agency. There's been countless cases of that. That's on the post-adoption side. There's also the issue of in the U.S. and in Australia, when there is domestic adoption, the birth mothers have power to be involved in their child's life, and they can choose to interact, whereas with international adoption, all contact is generally cut off. There is no rights on the side of the adoptee or the birth families, and that was the case in my situation. My birth mother was lied to by the agency, and she suffered for over 10 years searching for us. And if she had been allowed to even contact us, it would have alleviated the suffering. But a lot of adoptive parents I've heard do choose international adoption because they know that child is not going to have a direct contact or relationship with their home country and birth families. And to me, that is unethical. If you are going to have international adoption, it should be ethical on all sides, for the birth families, for the adoptee, and for the adoptive parents.
Okay.
But
Tammy, you did a brilliant job on that question. We got there eventually. I spied a little baby in the background. Jane, can you show us your baby?
Oh, I would love to. Okay,
Would you
I have
mind?
to pick her up.
We promised this in the pre-show. I hadn't forgotten everybody. Jane had a baby 2 months ago, and the little baby is in the background, and we're just going to see the baby here because we've been talking about babies. It'd be nice to see one. Here we go. Who is this? Their international network TV news debut on Al Jazeera. Hello. Hey, cutie. Who's that?
This is my daughter, Julia, and we are not at home right now. We're staying at the adoptee guest house called Korut in South Korea, and she's here with her adoptive grandma and grandpa right now, and so we decided to come up from the countryside and visit Seoul for a while and show them around.
Okay. Beautiful.
And, can I say something about the Adoptee Bill of Rights?
Do you know what? I wanted to move on from that just a little bit, Jane, because you're right now in South Korea. You moved from the States to Korea. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Why? What was important about that move for you?
Well, it kind of starts out with my adoption, which was fraudulent. It was on paper legal, but it was not ethical. So anyway, I was reunited with my family when I was in the United States for about 3 months. And so I spent my whole life getting back. And finally, after having been physically reunited with my Korean mother in 1995 and then wasting all of my income on airfare for the next 10 years, I decided to just move back.
Okay. How does it feel? Does it feel like home?
It feels like my uncomfortable home, just like the U.S. feels like my uncomfortable home. So, yeah.
Where do you belong, do you think?
I don't know. I guess with my baby.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for introducing Julie to us. Now, there was a however. When Laura says however, I get a little worried because we have less than a minute left, Laura. What point did you want to make, just very briefly?
The point that I wanted to make is that while I think that it's important for us to address the issues that have been raised on the supply policy side of the equation, I think it's also important to be able to talk about the important role that families and communities can play in helping to provide a real sense of belonging, so that feeling of displacement or isolation isn't something that's automatically going to accompany
a solution. There's
the placement of someone outside of
Right.
their country of origin or outside of their race or ethnicity.
Sure.
And I think that's where I get really worried,
Yeah.
is this notion that in order to provide a loving, stable, culturally relevant home, that your adoptive parents necessarily need to be of the same race or national origin.
Right. Okay. Wow, this has been a really fascinating conversation with Steve Morrison, Tammy Chu, Jane Jong Trenker, baby Julie, Laura Kleiss. Thank you very much indeed. And the community is saying what at the end of it?
I think they're saying that it's complicated, just like you were wrapping up in your comment. There's a Facebook comment here from Kim, and she says, I was adopted as an infant and have never faced any trauma. Every adoptee is different, and every environment in which an adoptee grows up in is different. There's no cookie cutter way that is right or wrong.
All right. Can we just see baby Julie one more time? Because she looks like she's at squishy stage. I just want to squish her cheeks. All right. Bye, Julie.
Here she is.
Thank you very much to all the guests. Really appreciate your time. All right. Moving on. On the next show, who's in charge of Yemen? That is a good question. We will try our best to find a good answer for you in the next AJ stream. See you soon.